Hello, Warren Dockter here. Today we're discussing Churchill's greatest books, and with me, as always, is Professor Richard Toye, and we'll be discussing Winston Churchill's book, Great Contemporaries, today.
Yeah, well, this was a book which was published in 1937, but it was actually a collection of essays on people such as Lord Rosebery, Joseph Chamberlain, John Morley, even Hitler, which had been published over a series of years previously. So, to a certain degree, this was a book which was a way of recycling and monetizing, if you will, things that Churchill had previously written.
And I wonder if is there much discrepancy between the original articles themselves and how they're produced in this book?
Well, sometimes there is. I think the most notorious essay is one on Hitler, which was first published in 1935, and it contains some rather some remarks which have been interpreted as being sort of overly sympathetic to Hitler. Now, in fact, if you look at the original and compare it with what was published in 1937, you see that actually the 1937 version is somewhat bowdlerized, so that very critical comments about Hitler's actions during the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 had actually been omitted. So that clearly, if you look at the intention of the original article, we can see that nobody would really say that it was too nice to Hitler. Partly that it was toned down somewhat at the behest of the Foreign Office, having very much annoyed the Germans, having annoyed the Nazis exceedingly in 1935. Churchill was prepared to tone it down on the grounds that it might be too provocative in 1937.
That's very, very interesting. And it's also interesting that this, I mean, if you look, this book has been republished numerous times, especially after the Second World War.
That's right. Yeah, I've got an Oddham's edition here, which was first published 1937, and an enlarged edition 1939, then published by Oddham's in 1947, and then reprinted in 1948 to 1949. Now, that seems like perhaps obscure, not very interesting detail, but of course what it tells us is that Churchill, as he became even more famous, as he became Prime Minister, as he became perhaps a global celebrity of the first order, of course, not only was he able to command a higher price for the books that he published after the Second World War, and of course he published a number during it as well, his speeches and so forth, but of course he was able to republish and sell many copies of books that he also written previous to World War II, and therefore this was really the time which, having struggled for money for really most of his life, I mean partly because he insisted on spending such enormous quantities of it, but having struggled financially for a long time, he after the war becomes seriously rich.
And it's through this sort of recycling. I mean, this is just another example of him taking something that he had written as an essay, collecting it, putting it in a volume, and then repeatedly reprinting the volume.
Well, that's right, but also during World War II, the Sunday Dispatch was printing his old essays, and so he was continuing. Of course, he was hugely in the public eye already, but his writings were being there, put before the newspaper reading public, every week throughout the war.
And that's really fascinating as well, because despite all this, of course, after the war, he sort of starts running out of money, and Chartwell, the house in Kent that absorbed so much of his time and money, actually was purchased for him by Lord Camrose and others.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think that he probably would have been able to sort of scrape by on the proceeds of his books had he wanted to. But I mean, I suppose that the other point that one might make about Great Contemporaries is that although it's written about other people, it's also quite revealing about him as an individual. There's autobiographical detail in there, such as the occasion when he met Lawrence of Arabia for the first time, and so this can't just be dismissed as a series of essays on other people. It actually tells us quite a lot about Churchill himself.
He comes across as, I mean, obviously he doesn't write on himself, but he becomes a character in almost every one of the stories. And I think that that way you can trace at least his sort of version of himself. through the story.
Yes, and I mean, of course, the other point is, who does he? There were more people who he could have included who he'd previously written essays on. It's all rather revealing who he does decide to include and who he doesn't.
Exactly. Well, thank you for joining us. See you next time.